that's going to be applied to areas and places, geography, and in terms of the service end of it, where they are most susceptible to fraud and corruption. So naturally here in New York and locally in the more developed cities, we have a full land registry system that has a lot of data in it, which would take a very long time to put into the blockchain. But just from a local and political cost point of view, there isn't much incentive yet. But again, we'll dive more into that. We're a few years away from seeing a full impact of blockchain in land registry, in title insurance, and everything else that goes with it. But segueing into our panel, I wanted to talk and introduce some of the guys here. So we have Perrin Qarshie from RealBlocks.
Yes.
We have Rick Morris here, a local Herrick Feinstein star. We have Ace, I'm not going to try to pretend to pronounce your last name. It's a very long name, so I don't want to butcher it. From Citizens, and we have Stephen King. So with that said, why don't we dive into some quick intros with what you guys are doing and how you are participating in blockchain now, and essentially what problems your companies are trying to solve.
Sure, I'm Perrin Qarshie, so I'm founder and CEO of RealBlocks. And RealBlocks actually is now being built to make the blockchain actionable and usable for the real estate industry. And the problem we're solving is that RealBlocks is the first platform that creates a truly global real estate market by making it possible for anyone to raise or invest capital from anywhere in the world. We're doing this using utility tokens, and we are really doing this on basically a technology called DAG, which is basically a hash graph that allows transactions to be settled faster by orders of magnitude than they can anywhere else. So I'm sure you all have heard about the latency issues with it taking days to get money into and out of Bitcoin, et cetera. We're not only solving that, but we're making real estate usable as an asset class for the $700 billion of capital on the blockchain. And just intro of my background, so I was most recently at Barclays doing M&A of REITs. Prior to that, I was at MIT where I did a lot of research on the blockchain at the Media Lab, and I began as an engineer. And just that's the history of where our platform is. We're basically launching now with some partnerships with most recently Terra Holdings, who owns Brown Harris Stevens and Halstead, and a couple of the other well-known names in the real estate scene in New York. So we're looking forward to bringing you this platform, and that's it. Thank you.
Good morning. First of all, thank you for the organization that and what was the website again?
AREAA, AREAA.org.
Everybody get that? So, and if you're not a member, please get up and leave now. My name is Rick Morris. I'm a partner here at Herrick Feinstein in the corporate department, and I was joking with everyone as we were going through the rehearsal that I'm the oldest person on the panel, and so when I started using computers and technology, it was punch cards and telephone wires and such. And the regulations that we look at to discuss blockchain and all the new data actually goes back before that. So one of the things that we do in practice at Herrick Feinstein, aside from the fact that we do everything on real estate, and real estate is in our DNA, is we're looking at the matrix of regulations that are confronting everybody who's dealing with the emerging technology. And we were talking about it before because what the SEC is saying today may very well change tomorrow. And the other thing that's fun is that you look at the matrix of regulatory agencies. You have to be a lawyer and a regulatory geek to think of this as fun. But you have the SEC and the CFTC that you might have seen are battling as to who's going to have jurisdiction over Bitcoin and blockchain, et cetera. They've been dealing with that since I started in the industry in the 1980s, and they've never resolved that jurisdictional, if you will, territorial fight. And then you have something new called the CFPB that's also in, because Bitcoins are also part of stored value or prepaid access. So when you have these wonderful things called tokens, you have a new regulatory agency that's dealing with it. So what we do here at Herrick is map through and help you navigate through the regulatory, if you will, matrix.
Well,
Thanks, Rick. And thank you, Dorian and Manish, for setting this up and for having myself. My name is Watansuparp. I'm actually the Executive Vice President for Citizens Bank. I am an early adopter. I invested in Bitcoin as well, and also did a little bit of mining, as Jason does here in the front. But in regards to the banking industry, I think if we talk about blockchain, is everybody's familiar with blockchain? Is there anybody in the room that does not know what blockchain is? I guess we'll start with that. Okay, that's awesome. So we have a whole crypto following here. So really, I think in terms of blockchain, it could have actually avoided the financial crisis. Because with blockchain, everything's transparent, everything's on a ledger. And I think if you go back to just banking, a lot of mortgage-backed securities were bought with AAA pools, prime, subprime lending. So if we had blockchain, all that would have been transparent. And I think the financial crisis would have been avoided. With what Rick was saying with CFPB and the SEC, I think when it comes to banking, if there is a way for these cryptocurrencies or blockchain to work with financial institutions, I think that technology is a game changer, in my opinion. And I don't want to take up too much time, but I do want to talk about mining a little bit. I'll have Dorian ask me that later on. But
you should point out, you're talking about banking. Talk about your day job besides mining.
Yes. So I am the regional manager for Citizens Bank. I manage the Manhattan Marketplace, New Jersey, Connecticut, LA, and Florida. So I do travel a bit. But with Citizens Bank, we are a portfolio lender in the city. And with that, with banking as well, if we actually adopted blockchain, and I'm a big proponent and believer in this, costs will be a lot cheaper too, because the technology is a lot faster and the cost is a lot cheaper. So if banking actually took on blockchain, which I do know banks that are actually utilizing the blockchain, I guess, technology now, such as Santander, Bank of America, and also folks like US Bank, they're all on blockchain. So, but with that being said, I'll hand it over to Steven, and then.
You guys hear me? Okay. Hey everybody, I'm Stephen King. I'm not an author. And I'd like to thank Two Kings for having us here today.
I saw someone reading your book earlier this morning. He's our cousin.
So I'm the CEO and founder at Rex, and we're taking a data-driven approach to the blockchain. So we are creating a global transaction portal and real estate marketplace. And so what that means is, in essence, we're syndicating or creating a virtual handshake between the many disparate real estate networks around the world into a decentralized marketplace, so a virtual marketplace that's owned by the people that are participating data. And the information is sourced, validated, and secured through what is called the Ethereum blockchain. We use smart contracts and what's called crypto economics for incentive mechanisms. So where the incumbent portals, the behemoths, silo our data behind expensive paywalls, we enable users to own, maintain, and control their information. And the value that comes out of this is wider access, lower cost, and we can create a new marketplace to buy and sell, exchange real estate data, much like we do goods and services on Amazon.
So Dorian and I will take turns asking questions. I'm sorry. So Dorian and I will take turns asking questions, and then at some point just open it up. I think I'm going to ask this to the two entrepreneurs out there. Right now, how are you dealing with funding and actually getting your idea and technology out there? Let's start with Steven and kick it over to Perrin.
Sure. So we didn't set off to really create a company. We were trying to solve a problem that we had. My background, I had a development firm in brokerage in Princeton, New Jersey, and realized I was paying about $10,000 a year for access to the various MLSs. So I created an application that essentially would scrape the internet and put it into a database that I built. And I learned pretty quick that you can't do that. There's a lot of end user licensing agreements that say, we don't want you having our data. So I came across this white paper on Ethereum, and as I'm sure we'll talk about, thought it would be a great tool for real estate transactions. But that actually led me down another rabbit hole of something called IPFS, which is a new data distribution protocol. And what this technology says is, if I'm going to, well, let's say what the technology says without it. If I'm going to send an email today, let's say, to Dorian, the path that it's going to take is from my computer, if I'm using Gmail, to Google's server up in White Plains, New York, to Dorian, even though we're right next to each other. What this protocol says is let's just have it go from Stephen to Dorian, or the shortest possible route. So that was really exciting because we can cut out these middlemen that are taking and getting in between our data. So what we did to raise money initially is we put together a proof of concept to solve one of our own problems. We raised some seed money, and then as we built it out, we did what's called a token sale. You guys may know it as an ICO. We did that, we completed that in August, and we sold tokens in exchange for Ether. And so now we've got Ether, and we're using that to fund our project. Now, there was a lot of challenges that was involved in that process. One example right now is that we have Ether right now, we don't have dollars. And I have co-founders and employees, and I have to pay them in Ether, which is some of the barriers that I'm sure you'll allude to. But yeah, so that's how we got through our fundraising.
Appreciate it, thank you.
Okay, so for us, I set out also to solve a problem that I had. So I bought my first property when I was 22 years old, back in 2010, and I was really frustrated extremely with the legacy sort of antiquated cartel system that I thought real estate brokers were operating. And so I thought that when I got to MIT and I started doing research on the blockchain and various tech in that respect, I thought, a lot of these things people are building are 20, 30 years away, and why don't people actually solve a problem that exists today? And so that was the genesis of RealBlocks. And we actually just, we're basically working in San Francisco, and we got into Techstars FinTech Accelerator here, and we raised, essentially a pre-seed from Barclays and Techstars Venture Fund, and we actually just finished, and now we are, raising a seed of about $2 million, and it's closing up very quickly with some pretty well-known names. But I'd say that we're sort of taking a different path in that, based on a lot of considerations, like as we were mentioning with the regulatory landscape, a lot of companies now are having to get the platform up and running before selling anything. So we're taking that approach, and we're building also essentially a POC, and that's enabling us to get some clients in the door and get some revenue. So we just signed a $30 million agreement with Ameristar Residential for the first batch of inventory that's going to be on the platform. So we're taking the approach of getting the platform up and running, raising the seed now, and then also selling essentially memberships as a premium access. So that's where the token sale will come in. But we've been working with Sullivan on it, and our approach is that it's a little bit safer now in the context of the regulatory uncertainty, to not have the token sale viewed as a capital raising effort. So that's how we're handling it.
So I think that's a good that's a good segue to ask the attorney and more. I think you have an accounting background as well on the panel.
Right.
Can we do an ICO of this room and raise some money?
Well, can everyone hear me? Is this on? So, can you do an ICO? Yes, of course. But what's happening is that you're facing a matrix of regulatory oversight. And we were talking about it before. What the staff is saying, the staff at the SEC has a very broad view of what a security is. And one of the reasons that they have a very broad view of the definition of securities, that is the portal, not what you think about a portal, but that is the regulatory portal to which they get to have jurisdiction. So if I look to the real estate brokers and I said a piece of real estate, a citrus farm in Florida, security? Just regular farm, grapefruits and stuff? US Supreme Court and the SEC have decided it is. So when you look at the tokens and you look at the way that you're raising capital, the real question is the value of what you're selling going to increase or be dependent on the management of people like you? If it is, it's more likely going to be a security. And if it's not a security, and it's a currency, someone was talking about buying and selling real estate using cryptocurrencies, then currencies itself are not regulated by the CFTC. Then you go into the banking regulatory environment for the currency, because at some point it goes into US dollars. And then if not, when you sell a token, it's actually, and you're going to use it as a stored value, there's a whole nother set under the banking regulations, but now under the jurisdiction of the CFPB, which may or may not exist next year. You know, depending, you know, the banker is laughing at it, but it might be one of the few federal organizations that gets retired. But they have various regulations, and if they go away, the regulations are gonna stay because another regulator will come in. So the answer is yes, but you are going to have to file a lot of forms and provide a lot of disclosures. And you can see that a lot of people who are not doing it correctly, I'm not suggesting that, you know, but the way that you're doing it is correctly, but the people who are not doing it correctly, when you read the blogs with the SEC, it seems like at least once a week they're shutting someone down on fraud. So there's that as well.
Thank you.
So regulatory landscape is pretty in-depth, and it's important to really take a fine, tooth comb to it and look at it properly before going forward. Perrin, do you want to share any experience that you had with and Stephen also, as far as getting to a point of ICO and some of the challenges that you had with getting to that point?
Sure. So for us, we initially had the idea of obviously launching this as a platform to allow people to transact in real estate, and the challenge was being able to do so in a manner that was compliant. I mean, given the SEC's guidance. So I think that one of the first challenges was determining whether we were going to be launching as a security or a utility token. And so, the analysis that we got and the advice we got was that essentially we had to have the platform up and running and be very careful and thoughtful with the marketing of the platform. And there are also considerations such as general solicitation. I mean, in pre-sales, many ICOs use pre-sales. If it's a security, then it has to be done under Reg D, and then general solicitation is not permissible. And then we also have a broker-dealer that we're going to be using. And so those were some of the things that I think you definitely needed to, we definitely were advised to consider that shaped the direction we're going. And then, the next consideration, as mentioned with the CFPB and CFTC, is that we're sort of utilizing those tokens as a currency, so then there's a whole other analysis there. So I think, the important thing is just, to essentially find good counsel and then work closely with them. We basically had a lot of changes, and it's a sort of iterative process, because you have a concept, then you will decide with your counsel what's legally feasible, then you decide with your engineering team what's technically feasible, and then those change, and it's kind of an iterative process. So that's how we handle it.
How about you, Steve?
Yeah, so for the last 2.5 years, we've been working with attorneys and talking to regulators, both here in New York and all over the world. And we started out with the question of, well, hey, how would you guys perceive these smart contracts if we could try to transact these physical assets, just like we're doing this with digital assets? And 2 years ago, they were like, no way. And I don't know that much has changed other than some of the use cases that we've seen, and there has been a lot of fraud. But the path that we took was we presented and architected our token in a certain way, and then worked very closely with our accountants, our attorneys, and presented it to regulators, saying we're building a little bit of a different type of platform. So we're building a database that's not owned by us. It's owned by the users that are participating in the data. And our token has an actual economic value. So the token is used to do things like scrub spam, for instance. So there's a voting mechanism where if I upload a listing, then my peers can flag it. And to flag it, you have to pay money. So you better be confident that that is a stale piece of property. And then it goes to arbitration where people vote for or against. Again, this is with money. So we've separated ourselves from this process so that every market can run autonomously. And we've also made sure there's no distribution of of capital or revenue or anything like that. So we're kind of stepping away once we get this up and running. Now, with that said, it doesn't mean that we're in the clear by any stretch of the imagination. One of the questions that we may get to is if you could change one thing in the regulatory environment, it would be the classification of these tokens. Because with a security, you can do certain things that are different than a token. With a token, you can burn a token and that has value. But you're not gonna burn a security unless it's Yahoo stock or something like that. But there's some fundamental differences that need to be addressed, and I think they are being addressed. And I think the SEC is taking a very pragmatic approach to the entire technology and industry.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing. When Stephen, when you said you spoke to the regulators, and as the innovations continue, it's important to realize that the door is open for the regulators. They will receive your inquiries, and there are various committees in Congress that are looking at this as well. People in Washington and in New York and other spots that are regulatory environments want to get this right. And so as you are coming up with a new innovation, you can actually speak to the government regulators, and that gives you an added benefit. When you do something new and innovative, the regulators are going to see it. And it's much better for the person who's on point to sit there and say, oh yeah, I know that this was happening, and you'll have a lot less blowback on that, and a lot better to do it. We've done that. This is not the only innovation that the regulators have seen over the last 20 years. It's just the newest version of it.
Yeah, I would just echo that also. I mean, we've also, our lawyers have, engaged the SEC, and you can speak to them in a no-name basis. So that's been very helpful in shaping kind of the direction of our platform. So I can't emphasize that enough.
Yeah, so it looks like just from that feedback that there's a lot to consider for those in the room who are thinking about ICO or at the point of doing some research as far as how to get to that point. It obviously can be costly. So you could use Rick. Rick, can we offer an ARIA discount for ARIA members?
Absolutely.
So there you go, ARIA member value right there.
And less even if you pay me in tokens.
There you go. So I want to segue quick with Ace as an investor of blockchain crypto. You could also reflect on this with how you can see it applied on the banking side. But as an investor, what are the types of services or products that are being offered out there with blockchain or crypto, and how do you think it can be used in your industry?
Yeah, I guess it's ironic, right? Me working for a bank, talking about crypto, because it's actually just against the ethos of what crypto is. But in terms of regulatory, and in my viewpoint, I think it's almost like the internet boom, right? So during the internet boom, there were a couple of winners from that boom. And I think we're in the same era where there's gonna be a couple of cryptocurrencies that actually win and a couple of blockchain companies that actually win in today's game. And I think for me, being on the banking side, I like Ripple a lot, right? So I invested in Ripple when it was 20 cents, then went up to 380, put in like 25K, went up to like 450, lost all 450s, back down to like 90, 95 cents. But I truly believe by December of this year, it should go up to at least over $7.
Let's not give trading advice.
And exactly. So that's my belief, right? So full disclosure.
As a bank, he's allowed to do that. Don't worry about it.
Safe harbor. So full disclosure, don't follow my advice, but that's my belief, right? And the reason why I think Ripple will be a winner is because their technology, they transact 1,500 transactions per second. With Bitcoin, it's around 7 transactions per second. If you looked at, and what they stand for is a financial global, trading forum, right? So what does that mean? So when you look at international wires, there's this code called SWIFT. Basically, Ripple's technology is something that's similar to SWIFT. SWIFT has 11,000 financial institutions working with them within over 200 countries. I think Ripple has the potential to do the same. So looking at that perspective and looking at what Ripple stands for, and they have worked with MoneyGram already. They have signed up with American Express, U.S. Santander, Bank of America, they have, I believe, over 50-something banks, and you know, me being in the banking industry, I like that, right? Now, in terms of cryptocurrencies, I think if you look at more distressed countries where, you know, to Dorian's point before earlier, where it's not as stable, you know, where they don't trust the government, that's going to be used quite a bit. So I think mass adoption will be key for cryptocurrencies. But in terms of, you know, just investments, I would say I look at blockchain companies, technology that are willing to work with financial institutions more than not, just because I feel that, you know, and I talk about this with Jason a lot, I feel like sometimes, you know, that Goliath type of mentality going against the regulatory environment is very, very tough from my standpoint, so.
Thank you. So I have a question for Ace, and then actually after that, I think what we'd like to do is have the panelists feel free to bring up anything else they want or ask any other questions to the other panelists, and then bring it open to the crowd. So, but here's a question for you, Ace, and this is something that goes a bit to what you're talking about and where you sit inside of banking. You know, I've seen different components to this. Again, I'm using this old framework, and I joke about it of what the internet did, right? Where companies that I was taking public that had multi-billion market caps disappeared, right? Alta Vista, InfoSeek, people don't remember these, but these were the search engines, right? They had billions of market cap valuations. No different in some ways to when people talk about the currency values that are out there. And here's where I'm seeing the categories, and I'm curious how the banks get involved. You mentioned Ripple, and I'm glad you did. Ripple, to me, is in some ways antithetical to the ethos of Bitcoin. You got a dude who's controlling it, who's a venture capitalist. It's like someone like me. We're doing it for ourselves. Let's not kid ourselves, right? Instead of Bitcoin distributed, there's a mathematical formula defining it. So here's a question for you first as a trader, and then going to the banking perspective. First, as a trader, there are things like Bitcoin where you supposedly can't manipulate it and create more. And then you have other things that seem to have functional utility, such as this fellow's tokens, Stephen's tokens, etc. As an investor, what do you think is better? And then, as a bank, which one of these or any would you lend against if I have a lot of value stored there?
So that's a great question. I look at it two different ways, right? I look at currency and technology, right? So I would consider blockchain the technology, and I would consider Bitcoin currency, or different forms of Bitcoins. So to me, I think the winner, in my opinion, will be the technology. And I think the ability to, and the two gentlemen here, Perrin and Stephen, they're doing that right now, right? So I would definitely, that's why I was actually very, very excited to be on this panel. I wanted to hear what these guys had to say. But if you look at it on a technology standpoint, it answers my question on the second question, right? Which is, what would the bank be bullish on? And I think the banks, if you looked at what we deal with today, with loan estimates, you know, just closing costs, just application disclosures, utilizing blockchain will eliminate a lot of the infrastructure and the cost that the banks pay today, right? And I think the banks are actually looking to adopting this technology today to make it cheaper for our clients.
So I'm going to grab it back for 1 second and then let the panelists ask each other questions. Again, going back to the old era, we used to talk about B2C. So the first things you used to see in that generation were consumer-facing applications. When I look at something Perrin is doing, is a lot of it is consumer-facing, although there is a B2B aspect. But the things you're talking about, sorry if I wasn't speaking loud enough, are huge. And when I have talked to banks as well as investment banks, there's a fellow from a bigger investment bank in the room, they have massive data integrity as well as transaction verification things going on. I mean, you think of the absurdity of 5 days for a check to clear, 3 days for security settlement to clear, lots of paperwork in back office. The kind of implied market cap of the cost there is over $1 trillion of ridiculous, antiquated processes. So anyway, feel free to ask each other questions.
Just on that note, I would say that, with your question about banking and lending, so we actually are working closely with Salt Lending because, the whole point of Real Blocks is to bridge the gap between real estate and the blockchain. And so doing that is more important to utilize, our platform as a store of value to marry those two worlds. And so, one thing that we've kind of been thinking about is, and we designed our platform in such a way that it's not that you're investing in a currency, or it's not that you're investing in something that's unknown. I mean, it's a hard asset. So Salt Lending has, they once had a $4 billion market cap, and they were getting close to, now the transaction value has gotten to the point where they're not taking any more new people on the platform. So Salt is really excited about this being the first opportunity that they could actually lend on a real asset. So not only with our platform are people getting a real asset that they could get a loan from a digital currency lender, they can also get a loan from a fiat lender as well. So that's kind of the way we're looking at it.
Yeah, I think one of the things that is interesting about this is it's a disruption. And so the question is, how are all of our industries going to face the disruption? And we were talking about it with, the title industry, how it has to be embracing this. A lot of people look at title industry because they insure title. That's what the name suggests, but they do a lot more. So maybe we should talk about some of the some of the ancillary services and services that your title insurance companies are doing, and dispel the belief that you're out of business because blockchain will give you the transparency and therefore you have title.
Right. Thanks for that, Rick. And we can talk a little deeper now about title insurance and blockchain and how it intertwines. I'll first start with, there's a perception out in the marketplace that blockchain will completely decimate and eliminate title insurance. If that were to happen, we're at least 20 plus years away from that. But what I could say is, having a previous experience in consulting as a management consultant for IBM, I've seen the task of the adoption of technology in other areas. But more specifically to title insurance, usually what most consumers are exposed to as far as what the process of title insurance is somebody that's going down to one particular data source, we'll call it a county clerk or a municipality, gathering information, creating a report, and then a title company throwing it against the wall and creating, assessing the risk and then creating a policy around it to ensure that title has transferred properly. There's a lot more that goes into that. It's not only as simple as that. If you looked at it that way, then yes, we can completely understand why there's a perception that title insurance is eliminated. Because if it's only one source, and you put that one source in the blockchain, then effectively there isn't really a need, or risk has been essentially completely mitigated. What really is the truth, though, is that title insurance companies are gathering information from a multitude of data sources that are, in some cases, still on paper. So there's still a need to actually get down, pull a microfiche, make a copy, understand it, absolve it in a way that you can make a judgment call on, and then create and assess the risk and create a premium and then an insurance policy consequently from that. So what and how we see blockchain affecting title insurance in the near future is, at first, really organizing and categorizing all the different areas that we do gather information. So even in the case of, let's say, ACE, where you originate loans, you do refinances, you're relying on somebody to make sure that there's certain documents being recorded, a satisfaction of mortgage, a new mortgage, a mortgage agreement. So at the end of the day, somebody will need to be charged with making sure that that happens. And that's just one category.
It's to your point, Dorian, I don't think with technology, the role and responsibility still stay the same. It's just technology will enhance and efficiently, make it for a better experience for the consumer at the end of the day, right? So, for me, if you look at the average age for a loan officer or an executive at a bank, it's right around 55 years old, right? So I'm a big advocate for blockchain, and I've spoken in many bank forums already. advocating for the technology to be shifted over, but it's an uphill battle too, because a lot of them are conservative and they want to make sure that regulatory is key, right, and compliance is key. So, you know, I think it will come a day, and it's I believe it's right around the corner actually with blockchain technology, where disclosures are as transparent and as seamless as almost quoting an interest rate. So I think that will be a benefit to the consumers.
Right, and then just to finish my part, and then we can go. I think the next iteration after the organization period for blockchain and its impact on title insurance is as a cost reduction and an efficiency play, where we begin to now tie into blockchain technology that's organizing the data that we would normally access and aggregate that or centralize that into some form so that it would effectively reduce risk and lower the cost of premium. At the end is the biggest hurdle, which is adoption. So going back to getting all this data onto a blockchain platform, it can take a very long time, especially here in a really developed country like the United States, where there's a lot of data and a lot of past data that you would have to retroactively add to the blockchain. Because remember, title insurance insures everything that's happened in the past, not what's going to happen or what can happen in the future. So those are all things to consider as far as how it's going to roll out.
So I'm going to fight you on that, on the time it'll take to get legacy information into digital era. You remember when people used maps and there was this globe that you couldn't see in 5 seconds on your phone? Google basically mapped the world in less than a year and a half, I think. So with AI, all this microfiche and all this other stuff, where they can do visual recognition, the data will be very, very quickly, historic data will be very quickly adopted. The interpretation and the risk analysis, that might take 3 years, but I think the information gathering will be extremely accelerated. Again, if you know, maybe we'll just take it in sequence. Stephen, if you have any questions for anyone else, please throw them out there. Also, if you have any kind of, what's the biggest impact you see on real estate, please bring that up, and then I'd like to open it up to the world. So we'll just take it in sequence, starting with you, Stephen.
Sure. So just going along with title, but also the biggest impact, just to correlate the two. So the biggest impact I see initially is communication and standardization. So how do we get from where we are today with this archaic paper system to, you know, more advanced, you know, blockchain system? And the path to doing that is bridging the gap between the digital and the physical world. So if we take a look at Bitcoin, you know, what really has it done? It's the value that it's provided the first real global standard for the way that we send, receive, and store digital assets, i.e. Cryptocurrencies. And it did this by using the blockchain, this fundamental technology. And so in order to bridge the gap, we have to connect this physical world with the digital world. So we can now do that because we can take a physical address and connect it to a digital hash on this global accepted database. And once we do that, we can do more advanced things like title, and the title agencies will most likely adopt and work with this. And we can do some really cool other things with these smart contracts. So we can add or we can expand on our coordinate systems. So if I want to identify this building on a map, I have an X and I have a Y coordinate. But if I want to identify this particular space on the 14th floor, there's no spatial coordinate for me to accurately identify it. So by establishing these property identification systems and using these smart contracts, we can disclose the dimensions of this space, its height from the street. And then if we get enough of these throughout New York City, we can compare them spatially and create a Z vertice, or a vertical vertice called Z. So we have X, Y, and Z. And this will be extremely beneficial to landlords who want to see how their space expands and contracts over time, to condo owners, or to inspectors who need to know where key infrastructure lives within a building. So, you know, in terms of a question, Perry, I'm just interested in some of the challenges that you guys have run into through either the development process or maybe just the education to your partners.
Sure. Yeah, so I think one of the challenges are, coming from a regulatory standpoint, as Rick mentioned, that's really shaped the evolution of the platform and the way in which we're planning to bring it to market. So the first phase, initially the idea obviously of blockchain is to enable and to democratize ownership, but it's difficult to do that because you run into securities restrictions. So, the first phase of our platform essentially is set up for people to transact buying entire assets, and the purchase of an entire asset is not viewed as a securities transaction. So that's phase one. Phase two is essentially an environment in which people can sell fractional ownership through private placements. So I'm sure some of you are familiar with platforms like Cadre. That's a similar model. Realty Shares also has that model, but we're launching with that and then building the tech to essentially enforce the resale restrictions and the transfer restrictions as well. So that is the second part. And then the third part is obviously trading, and that any security token has to be traded on an ATS, and nobody has that yet, even though there are a few that are launching or that are planning to launch later this year. So we're planning to build that internally. So I think the biggest challenge is, you're having to build your business around the regulatory restrictions associated with a regulatory environment that doesn't quite reflect the needs and potential of the new technology we have. So that's I'd say one of the biggest factors.
I guess to me it's fairly simple, right? If there's mass adoption with cryptocurrency, then cryptocurrency will have a huge effect on real estate, on the transactions. But if you look at what Steven and what Perrin are doing, I think that's key, right? Really understanding the use of the technology and understanding the companies that are actually coming out with a new wave of doing business in today's marketplace. And I'm definitely sitting down with Steven and Perrin right after this panel just to understand more about their company. But as I look at the landscape and as I look at where we are, last year we saw a huge influx of people running over and just investing in Bitcoin, not really knowing what it was about, right? And it had potential to have mass adoption, but then regulatory came in, and the SEC and the governments came in and literally shut it down in South Korea, and you saw it tank in Bitcoin tremendously, right? So to me, it's really about mass adoption. And if you look at where we are today, and you look at the internet boom, a lot of financial institutions actually invested during the internet boom first. I believe Manish actually mentioned this before. If you look at here, if you look at what's going on with crypto.
My firm lost $150 million investing in 1999 at
Right.
the top.
So if you look at crypto,
Not my money.
you have
Sorry,
a
I
lot
said the
of-
firm
no,
I was
no.
at lost 150 investing right at the
I
top.
know. So if you look at crypto, financial institutions didn't jump in first. So it was the early adopters. It's folks like us in this room that possibly invested in crypto. And now financial institutions are starting to invest in cryptocurrencies now. So I truly feel as if we're still at our infant stages, even though it seems like the buzz of Bitcoin or cryptocurrency sort of went away. I beg to differ. I think we're still at the infant stages. I think financial institutions are starting to understand a lot more about the blockchain technology, and there will be a couple of cryptocurrencies that will win, I believe. But it really depends on, what utilization they have and things of that nature. So my question is really to Steven and Perrin, what's your 5-year outlook with your companies today, right? So given the landscape of today, what needs to change to make your companies really at the target level that you guys want it to be?
So for us, it's two things, and it all comes back to regulation. So I won't dive into that. I'll let you guys talk about that. It's infrastructure. It's development infrastructure. So right now we've got sort of this Web 2 environment where you go on, you use Facebook, you just click a button. It doesn't cost you money. It's very easy to interact with. But in this Web 3 environment, this blockchain environment, we have all these new features. Let's say we have virtual wallets, private keys. We have to pay gas fees on some blockchains. And so for us, it's been educating and transitioning users from this Web 2 to this Web 3. And So September through December, I was out pitching firms all over the U.S. and what I learned is about 50% of our potential user base was not comfortable going into a secondary market and purchasing Ether, which is what you need the currency you need to have to transact on the Ethereum blockchain, to then use our platform. So we had to come up with some unique features that basically collect fiat dollars and exchanges it for ETH, and then we had to build a system that forwards those transaction fees on the user's behalf. So these are all things that, like, if you want to start a blog today, you can go on WordPress and you have all these plugins. We're not there. We're pretty early on, so we have to build all these tools ourselves, and it's a bit scary at times because you're building these tools, but you're also dealing with money. So there's a lot of things that can go wrong. So those are really, our challenges.
So I'm looking at our clock, and just in the essence of time management, I want to make sure to give the audience an opportunity to ask questions as well. So Rick and Perrin, if you have one last point, we'll take the question now, but if you have a point, you can make a quick point, and then let's open it up to the audience.
Yeah, my quick point is that there's a difference about data and the amount of data that's coming in from the blockchain and the interpretation of the data, and that goes back to title insurance. It's wonderful to have all this data, but someone has to interpret it. And from a legal point of view, you mentioned smart contracts. There are going to be ways that people buy and sell transactions without ever using a lawyer, which lowers your cost, and people are saying that's a good thing. That's a different deal.
So with that said, before we get to closing comments, let's open the floor to questions. I see that arm come up right there.
Recently, there was a company, Circle, that just purchased an exchange. Curious to see what the banker said.
I'll just jump in 1 second there. And I'm a former investment banker. I'll let the actual current banker talk after. But we were actually invited them to the panel. They had a conflict, maybe related to this, but they're based out of Boston, and they are actually transacting and allowing and dealing with 25 to 30% shift in currency pricing. They're focused on a limited number of currencies, but they will actually, I approached them and I said, if someone comes and calls me and says, hey, I want to buy your condo for $2 million, and I don't want to take that risk. And this is actually how this panel started. I called up Dorian. I said, Dorian, how long will you keep title open so I can get that currency hedged through Circle and through anti-money laundering and all the rest of it? And it was 2 hours. In 2 hours, I could take Bitcoin or Ether or whatever specific currencies they use through Circle, get it to pay off my lender and myself when I sell a condo. Now, in terms of the new acquisition, Ace, if you have an answer to that, go for it.
I mean, that's a really tough question in today's environment, right? So because of the volatility, I do know that there's actually insurance companies out in Canada that's insuring that exchange, right? But because it's so volatile, these companies are actually using offshore type of, like in the Caribbean islands, to actually, there's like a whole crypto community in the Caribbean islands that are actually insuring these crypto exchanges. On a banking standpoint, I still feel as if it's still very volatile, and Circle may be doing it, but I don't think.
So Circle's backed by Goldman and iBanker,
Goldman,
so
exactly.
yeah, they're taking more risk and they're out there.
So I guess, and I appreciate it. So listen, you're my new hero. I love the fact that he's coming in and he's saying, this is what we got to do, and it's trickling down here. What's the next step with this? This is obviously the future.
So that may be too open-ended. Maybe we get someone else to ask a question if there's any other questions. But
I think just to answer that question, I think as you start seeing Bitcoin, you're not seeing too much fluctuation anymore, correct? So I think there is, but not like the way that we saw it last year, I think.
Yeah, back in December, that was
Back in December,
way
that was
back
crazy.
then.
So I think as we start seeing more consistency and less volatility, that will open up the doors for financial institutions to come in and hedge against the market.
okay, the guy in the blue shirt.
So he's got 2 questions for you. First on Ripple. You and I are going to disagree on Ripple. We'll probably have 1,000 different opinions. But my question on Ripple is, aren't they proof that a blockchain can be effective and work without a cryptocurrency?
Yes.
Backing it. Doesn't that change the market a little? That's my first question. The second was on mining, right? So, look, like I mine, right? The electric costs in America are pretty high, right?
Yeah.
I think as we go from proof of work to proof of stake, right, just simply lower energy costs, you're gonna get a consolidation of some of these coins. If the consolidation happens in the Eastern Bloc countries, China, places that have less property rights laws and cheaper electric, aren't we at risk of centralization of the actual computing power?
I think to answer the first question with Ripple, I invested in Ripple not as a currency because there's like 100 billion Ripples out there, right?
Yeah.
Compared to 21 million in Bitcoin. So I invested in Ripple for the technology. So I don't see it skyrocketing to $100 per coin or anything like that. But you know, if it's right around 7.
Well,
and
7 puts it at a 700.
As a 700.
That's 3 times the current
Correct.
market cap of Bitcoin, right? So that's
Correct.
pretty big.
So-
yeah.
so
You
on
can't-
that-
Again, the blockchain can exist without the token. So do you
Correct.
think that's going to be the future where a company says, I don't need my own token, I can just create my own alpha?
Yeah, I think that's a possibility, you know, and that's, again, proof in concept over time.
Yeah.
That's really gonna really dictate where Ripple's price, or XRP's price will be at. But I do think there's gonna be a mass adoption on that technology platform. But to answer your point in mining, you know, I actually invested with a group of early adopters, and our mining is actually in China. So that, you know, 80% of the mining is currently there because it's cheaper. You know, there's a lot more. To your point, you know, you can actually purchase property there a lot cheaper, right? So, in terms of, you know, investing in GPUs, you know, hard drives, trying to figure out the hashes, I still feel as if doing it here in the United States is a lot more expensive. You know, just, I mean, the cost of energy alone will outweigh the profits in figuring out that hash volume to solve that algorithm. So I truly feel if you are investing, and look, I invested in mining in Ethereum last year. I made a little bit of money, then I shifted over to Litecoin using Script. That I made a pretty big profit last year, towards the end of the year. But I think mining, it's really, you know, I think Jason here, he's mining too. I think there's a lot of people in this room that are possibly mining. I would just say, figure out the hard costs, but then also figure out the energy costs, right? Because the energy cost is something where, you know, we don't have control over because these machines, they take up a lot of energy and they're on 24/7, you know, and a lot of the hardware, it actually, you know, it breaks down and crashes too. So just remember that as well.
Yeah, far left over here.
Hi, my question is about, I heard about blockchain about a year and a half ago, but actually in Africa. And in Africa, they're trying to solve a problem of identifying who the actual property owners are of rural properties. And it's, you know, it's been something that's been helpful for them. I'm wondering if anybody on the panel, perhaps title, can talk about how this can be implemented in rural communities here in the United States, where family-owned properties, maybe farmland, is fallow, is not being used because actual title cannot be cleared up. Counties are having a difficult time figuring out who owns what. And I'm wondering, is there a market in that in the U.S.? After seeing it done, like I said, in Ghana, I was interested if that was something that, you know, title companies could do out here in the U.S. or anybody on the panel. By the way, Stephen, I own Rex. Thanks.
Yeah, look, there's a tremendous impact that it could make in title, and you brought up a great example in rural America. Now, again, it comes down to the consolidation of the data itself and how it's the beginning part of disseminating that, putting that into the blockchain. So for example, probate court, you know, we often hear about inheritance, and there's a responsibility of certain documents to be filed to make sure that whoever has inherited the property actually has inherited the property. That itself, that process has to somehow get in a form of blockchain separately before title companies can even engage and figure out how to connect to that. There are a number of areas that blockchain can impact the process of title, and that's the reason why I said that at first it's going to be an organization of data play, then an efficiency and lower cost play, and then we'll see how adoption goes. But as far as getting back to real estate in general and blockchain, I feel like the initial impact is going to be some of the things that we've touched on, which is, for example, Stephen, you brought up a great example on commercial spaces where in the building itself, there's some transparency. There isn't really a knowledge of what's going on unless you engage in a particular company that handles due diligence for that. But I think blockchain has a big impact on due diligence. So if we knew exactly what leases were in play, and we knew we could use something like Ethereum to put code into how those contracts work. So did they make their rent payment that month? You know, do the lights turn on? Things like that. I think that due diligence is going to be the first area that's impacted with blockchain.
I'll answer that a little bit just by example. Right now, Two Kings is in the process of buying a property in Midtown. We're talking to two different banks because, you know, banks we don't trust as much as in the old days. And
Other than this one.
well, we didn't get to work with Citizens, so maybe we should talk to Citizens. But in general, they're asking us both to do a phase one. This is a property that had a phase one done. That's an environmental inspection, right? And they had one done 3 years ago. And a phase one is actually just reading public reports. It's not involving testing or anything like that, right? So it was done 3 years ago, and it would be extremely unusual under the same ownership if the place is just being used as apartments for anything to come up. So first of all, I probably shouldn't have to get a new one at all. Second, each bank has a different list of vendors. So Chris had to write the check twice, like $4,000, to two different phase one guys, because each bank has a different list of vendors to check something from 3 years ago that they really shouldn't check. So each property should really have a public ledger that shows the phase one that was done by a set of approved vendors that are nationally licensed, and we kill that whole thing. It's completely stupid, and it's wasting 4 weeks. So there are so many different things inside of real estate. Love to keep the questions a little more on real estate and blockchain. That it has to happen. I mean, this thing that's happening right now is completely pointless. It's just a big thud. 90% of it's like a photocopy of the last one. Sorry.
And not to disparage the people who are doing the phase ones, but what you're really talking about is the interpretation of data rather than the availability or reporting of data. And so that comes back to title. The reason that someone might have a title dispute is that there's an underlying dispute. And so now what you've asked is, why can't the lawyers clear the title? And we can be here for the next 2 years on that, but then you go to the courts. The other thing is that interesting about blockchain and how it's going to change things. People have an impression that when you file the land reports into the county clerk, that it's actually reported.
Right.
It is, after a long delay. There have been times where title has not been reported, does not show up to you for a year.
Right. In Westchester County, it's 6 weeks behind, so I can submit a document today and it'll take them 6 weeks to actually put it on public record.
And that's going to be the change. But again, it's the interpretation of the data.
So sorry, Jason?
Yes.
I guess we've heard, and then this fellow, and then someone over here.
You got to get the right side of the room engaged.
Yeah,
but,
exactly.
we're pretty much coming up on time
Yeah.
right now, so let's.
All right, so I started with kind of title question. I'll try to tie a couple things that I heard like real quickly. I heard one of the gentlemen back there talk about mining. I know Ace is doing mining. As much as the electricity costs are very important, I think people are kind of glossing over the initial hardware costs of it that are doubling and sometimes even tripling with that. That'll be more than make up what the electricity is. China's put on additional restrictions because of their cheap power, so they're starting to push out their miners, moving to Russia, moving to other more cold climates, and then Bitmain, who's the main one, is starting to have competitors, so the free market's going to have the mining be a little bit cheaper. I heard you mention about Salt. Ace and I were talking about Salt, a couple times. I got invested in them in stage one. I think they're a brilliant company. I think there's going to be other competitors that are doing that, and that's going to bridge those who have crypto who want to get into the real estate side of it, because the traditional banks, they're not going to lend on it, so then there's third parties that will lend on it. So the question to Dorian is, you had talked about really centered on title, and you were saying that it might take like 20 years. Manish, I agree with you, that's going to be a lot quicker. I think that's going to come. But my question is, do you think that a market like New York is going to be more beneficial to it? Or I heard the lady back there speak about in some of the emerging markets in Ghana that, where there's a lot more dispute over title. Do you think that the blockchain application is going to be better for a market like New York or for emerging markets?
Right, and good question as far as separating adoption and how quickly different areas will adopt. So the 20 years, the framework I gave was more of if there's ever a possibility of getting it to a point where title insurance, the cost of it is so low that you can essentially say you don't really need it, right? Hopefully that never happens, obviously. But look, we have another technology that's in place now that one of the things Rick brought up and that I kind of added to was the process of recording. So recording documents at county clerks, there's actually an electronic way of recording documents now. You can do it online, right? So I'm going to use that experience as far as just adoption in general and to answer your question. So areas where there is very minimal land registry presence, that has the area of biggest impact because they need to get organized and they need effectively to have a system to base or pass judgment on when it comes to transactions, whether it's title or whether it's a bank even underwriting, whether or not they would issue a loan on it. Now, New York, I'll get really hyper-focused since we're in New York and it's Asian Real Estate Association Manhattan chapter. New York has the least reason to, and it's because our land registry system is probably the most in-depth and for the most part the deepest in terms of the amount of data that it has. So it has the least incentive. It probably has a benefit obviously because there's so many transactions happening in Manhattan. But when you look at just federal budget in general, or whoever is going to fund this, whether it's private or public,
Private.
right? Or is it private? It comes down to where you're going to end up getting the most return on that investment, right? And for now here, there's the political layer of all the employees now at county clerks, and that's just the county clerks. There's 62 counties in New York, right? With towns and villages in certain areas, depending on where you are. Each one of those towns and villages has a different way of keeping their data. So there's going to be a large effort, and I'm making it sound more of a task than it is with regards to how long it's going to take. But to quickly answer your question, New York is generally a last adapter when it comes to technology.
And I know we may be kicked out of here because lawyers have to bill. There's a question over there. If there's one or two questions on this side, would love to take them.
I have two questions. One is more of a general, I guess, adoption. We're over 3,000 counties. If anything, I think U.S. is decentralized, property value. I mean, everything is decentralized. Each county has its own information, and everyone's trying to centralize this via blockchain. We're obviously going to have different blockchains like EOS and DMU and stuff like that. So, adoption, how long do you think, guys, it's going to take to adopt, for counties to adopt that, especially the ones that already have some kind of electronic systems like Florida, 67 counties, one of the most efficient states. That's question number one. And question number two, in terms of New York City, blockchain is set to basically disrupt the whole market, push of a button, the sale happens, purchase. How do you think that co-ops will react to it where you actually have to go through a physical interview and submit an application? How does that system tie into the
So on the first question you asked with respect to adoption, I mean, so we're the way we're thinking about it is we're growing through partnerships with brokers because the brokers are licensed in the city in which they're operating. So essentially they would carry out the transactions on the back end. And that doesn't require any additional work or any additional education. So I think that's the way we're handling it. That's the most seamless way, is to essentially make it ridiculously easy and ridiculously simple such that the players that are already in the space can carry that out. And then with respect to title, I mean, the way we're thinking about title is we're holding them, basically we're creating an entity, be it an LLC or an MLP, for each asset, and that entity would hold title. So title is recorded once in the onboarding process, and then we essentially allow it to transfer as the tokens transfer among parties. So therefore, it centralizes the title of each property, and it's essentially within our system, so you don't have to worry about the recording and the latency there.
Just in terms of the title, so we're not trying to do title. Title is a massive undertaking, but what we're doing is, since we're taking in real estate listings data, we're just making that correlation between the digital and the physical world that I mentioned earlier. So we're giving it a unique hash, and then we're going to just open source this, and we're talking with other companies, Foam and a number of others, that our hope is that somebody's going to eventually do this in the entire United States. Now, it may be a title company, it may be an entrepreneur, but at least if you can establish that initial baseline where there's some data to work with, and there's and you open source it, which is a big premise in the blockchain community, I think that that's an easier path to digitizing title in the very beginning.
So we're pretty much on it. We're getting kicked out, but I want to thank everyone that participated in this panel. I want to thank everyone that made it out this early in the morning. We're open for questions on the side, but we have to end it at this point. So thank you for joining Asian Real Estate Association. Please join, and we have a big event coming up on Thursday, so we'd love to see you there. Thank you.